Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So in this video, I'm going to be going over my ranking for the Richard Bachman books. So for anyone who doesn't know, Stephen King wrote a few books under a different pen name, Richard Bachman. So early on in King's career, he was actually writing so much that he really wanted to publish at least 2 books a year, but his publishing company only really wanted him to do 1. So he actually started writing under a different name, Richard Bachman, and he consistently was releasing 1 or 2 books a year. But as he became more and more popular, people started to catch on that this Richard Bachman fella sounds a lot like Stephen King. So there's a total of 7 Richard Bachman books. 5 of them were written in probably the heyday of Stephen King in the 70s and 80s. One of them was released in the 90s and is more of a companion novel to Desperation. And then the other one was released in 2007 called Blaze, but it was actually a trunk novel that King never really intended on releasing. So for me, probably the 2 main differences between the Richard Bachman books and his normal Stephen King books are that they're all relatively short, which King, does have shorter novels, but a lot of the times he likes to elaborate, right? And then the other difference is that a lot of these books are very pessimistic or nihilistic in tone, whereas a lot of King books, they, while they are scary and have really intense moments, some of them, have the tendency to end on, at least somewhat hopeful terms. But every Bachman book, pretty much, they usually have a great ending, and they usually have endings that are like I said, very nihilistic. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So by far, my least favorite Bachman book, and just in general, just one of my least favorite King books in general, is Rage, which I don't have like an actual copy of it because it's super rare, but it is in this bind-up of the Bachman books. See, there it is. There's not really a whole lot I enjoyed about this book. Like I've said before, the main reason I read King is because of the characters, and the main character in this book, I'm not a huge fan of. I'm not going to say that this is necessarily a badly written Stephen King book, but for me the subject matter is just, it's a product of its time, right? It's about a kid who takes over a classroom, shoots his teacher, and holds the classroom hostage. And this is way before, like Columbine and just a lot of school shootings that have happened, like in my lifetime. And this was written, in the 70s, way before any of that. So I understand, that it's before that kind of environment started happening. I'll try my best not to spoil any of these books, but just the way that King approaches the subject matter just seems very unrealistic, especially when it comes to like today's standards. You read it and you're like, this would not happen. And for King, his whole thing is to get you to believe and invest in a story that is not plausible, because he has tons of supernatural elements. But this book, it doesn't have any of that. And so it doesn't feel like it would happen in real life, and that just sucked me right out of the story. And my 6th favorite Richard Bachman book would be The Running Man. This book is different from a lot of King books in that it's not very character focused. It's more so idea focused, maybe like theme focused, and just it's very plot driven, which is not necessarily why I read King. While it's not necessarily a bad book by any means, it's nowhere near my favorite King, and it's definitely, like, it's number 6, right? So it's near the bottom of the Richard Bachman books list. However, if I were to make a best Stephen King endings video, this might make my top 10, because while the book as a whole, the book as a whole isn't necessarily terrific, it's fine. I think I gave it, 3, maybe 3.5 stars. The ending is, like, perfect, and it really just, I mean, without that ending, this would be not a very enjoyable read. But the ending is just very cathartic. And my number 5 Richard Bachman book is The Regulators, which is actually the companion novel to Desperation. I don't often see people liking both of these books equally. There's usually people who much prefer Desperation, or there's people who much prefer The Regulators. I'm not a huge fan of Desperation, but The Regulators, I feel, is much better. If I had to use one word to describe this crazy book, it would be wacky. It's just wacky. Sometimes when you read King, you can kind of feel like an overall, maybe kind of theme for the book, maybe some kind of lesson, right? Or just overall, like, feeling of the book. But with this, it's just madness. And that's the whole point. It's madness. It's not a perfect book by any means, but it's still just a terrific, fun time. I think I'd probably give it 4 stars. And my number 4 favorite Richard Bachman book is Thinner. It's a really weird concept. You've got, like, this huge, like, 350-pound lawyer who accidentally runs over an old gypsy woman, and her husband puts a curse on him, and he just says, "Thinner." And over time, he starts losing weight, and at first he's like, "Oh, wow, I'm starting to look good." But then once he starts losing too much weight, oh no. And this is one of the best-paced King books you'll ever read. It's 300 pages, and it just flies by. Everything is, it just feels like a perfect read. And while it's not a perfect book, which doesn't make sense, it's just a really good read. And before, when I was talking about Richard Bachman books being very nihilistic, like, get to the ending of this book and you'll see why. And my third favorite Richard Bachman book ever is Blaze. This is Stephen King's sort of take on the story of Mice and Men. The two main characters in this book are supposed to be kind of representative of the two main characters you get in Of Mice and Men. But of course, it's Stephen King, so you get sort of a much more darker twist on it. And he says at the beginning of the book that this is essentially a trunk novel. He wrote it way back in the early 70s and probably just didn't feel like it was good enough to publish. But, I mean, it's really good. Not even just for a Richard Bachman book, just as King goes, it's really good. And just to sum it up, it's just a very underrated, character-driven King novel. And if you haven't heard of it, or if you haven't read it, and you're already a King fan, I would say this is a must-read. And my top 2 Richard Bachman books, man, it's so hard to choose which one is my favorite. I like them for different reasons, and they're just 2 completely different stories, but they're both 5-star books for me. It's so hard to choose. For now, I'm just going to say that my second favorite Richard Bachman book is The Long Walk. This was actually one of the very first King books I ever read, way back in like, must have been 7 years ago at this point. And I've only read the book once, so a lot of the details are not super fresh in my mind. But I do remember the feeling I had when I read this book, and my eyes were glued to the page, and I could not put it down. For any reason, I had to know, like, what happened. And while this isn't the very first book he published, I'm 95% sure that this is the first book he ever wrote. You could almost consider this book one of the first, like, young adult dystopian novels, and that might be a weird thing to lump King in with, but that's pretty much what this is. The basic premise of the book is that you've got these 100 kids, and you basically start them out on like a highway, and they have to walk, and they can't stop, and they have to keep going for days and days on end, and you basically get 3 warnings. If you stop, 3 times for like a certain amount of time, like, you will be shot, and whoever wins this long walk, they get whatever they want. And that's a crazy ass premise. And of course, this was way before anything like, like the Hunger Games or Divergent or any of those sort of newer young adult stories. This also has one of the best ending lines of any book I've ever read. When you get to the end of the book and you read that last line, it's good. And for any King fan who has read all of the Bachman books, you know what my number 1 pick is. But if you don't know anything about Richard Bachman, you'll find out right now, because my number 1 pick is Roadwork. And I know this is a very, very, very unpopular opinion. Many people despise this book, which is understandable. It's not a horror book. There's no supernatural element. There's no real plot. It's basically just a 300-page character examination. And if you don't like that, you're not going to like this book. But I think if you go into it knowing what you're going to get from it, if you give it a chance, I think a lot of people would actually enjoy it. But I still think it's a very criminally underrated King book. And while many people would easily put this in their bottom 10 King books of all time, I'm very tempted to put it in my top 10 favorite. That's how much I like it. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. What are some of your favorite and least favorite Bachman books? What is your ranking of the Bachman books? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw here, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and have a terrific day.